Last week I was determined to have a Friday night pizza night, and I wanted to recreate a sourdough version of Sicilian pizza, which is popular on the East Coast. I fell in love with this crunchy square style of pizza in New York last year. I tried a plain cheese Sicilian at Di Fara Pizza, which was fantastic, and I got to try a Sicilian pizza with 3 different sauces from Crispy Pizza in Brooklyn, and it's one of my favorite flavor combinations on pizza. So last week I recreated both of these pizzas with a sourdough crust, and I baked them in my home oven. I want to share that process with you today. So on Thursday night, I got out 25 grams of leftover sourdough starter, and I fed that starter 50 grams of lukewarm water. I stirred the starter around a little bit in the water to dissolve, and then I fed it 50 grams of plain white bread flour. I used the blue bag of King Arthur bread flour, which is what I use in a lot of my sourdough recipes. No special pizza flour needed. Once I fed my starter 50 grams of water and 50 grams of flour, I stirred it thoroughly to combine. Then I marked the top of the starter with a rubber band to watch how much it would grow. And then I let the starter sit out on the counter overnight at room temperature for exactly 8 hours. And in the morning, it looked like this. It had doubled in size and it was ready to use to make my pizza dough. Now this is how I made the dough. This recipe yielded enough dough for 2 9x13 pans of pizza. I started out with a mixing bowl on my digital scale. I added 330 grams of water, and then I added 100 grams of that active and risen sourdough starter that I had fed the night before. Then after adding all the starter, I took the jar of leftover sourdough starter, which had about 25 grams left over, and I moved it back to the fridge, and it'll be ready for the next time I want to bake. Then I broke up the starter a little bit with a spoon and stirred it around to try to dissolve the starter into the water. After that, I added 12 grams of olive oil to the wet ingredients. Then I stirred that together to combine. And I added 525 grams of plain white bread flour, using the same brand as I used to feed the starter, the blue bag of King Arthur bread flour. Then for the last ingredient, I added 13 grams of kosher salt directly on top of the bread flour. And then I stirred it all together with a spoon, and it really is a stiff dough. It's 66% hydration, which is a lower hydration than my standard sourdough bread recipe. So it took about 2 minutes of mixing with a spoon until all that flour absorbed the water. But once the dough wasn't sticking to the sides of the bowl anymore, I covered it up with a kitchen towel and let the dough rest for 30 minutes. And a half hour later, the flour in the dough had absorbed most of the water and the dough was holding together a lot better than before. It was time for the first set of stretch and folds. So I took my dough and stretched a corner of the dough up into the air, then folded the dough over the top of the dough. Then I grabbed the next edge of dough, stretched it up, and folded it over the dough. I did this process over and over again, stretching a corner of the dough up into the air and folding it over the top of the rest of the dough. Did that about 10 to 20 times until the dough was really feeling stronger, smoother, and the dough started to resist the stretching. After that, I took a kitchen towel and I covered the dough up and let it rest for another 30 minutes at room temperature. Then half hour later, I uncovered the dough and gave it another set of stretch and folds. This time though, I stretched the dough a total of 4 times, and then I covered it up and let it rest for another 30 minutes. And then a half hour later, I did the third and final set of stretch and folds, which was definitely the easiest because the dough had smoothed out and it was really holding together well at this point, really starting to feel like a smooth pizza dough. So I flipped the dough out onto the counter with the smooth side up, and I knew I had written this recipe to make enough dough for 2 9x13-inch pans of pizza, so I divided the dough evenly as I could into 2 pieces with my bench scraper. Then later I noticed that the dough balls were definitely not the exact same size, which normally I don't care about, but since these pizzas need to fill the pan, I didn't want one to be a super thin pizza and one to be a super thick pizza, so I weighed them out to make sure they were exactly the same weight in grams. And this recipe technically makes enough for 2 490-gram dough balls, but I had clearly lost a few grams of dough along the way in the mixing process, so I ended up with 2 balls of dough that weighed exactly 481 grams. So to let these dough balls get started on their first rise, I moved them each to an oiled glass bowl, then I covered them, one with an airtight lid and one with some plastic wrap. Then I let the dough balls rest on the counter at room temperature and rise for a little over 6 hours. Then while the dough is rising, I decided to make my pizza sauce ahead of time so it would be ready in the evening. Sicilian style pizza usually calls for a cooked tomato sauce, so I got the best tasting peeled tomatoes I can find, San Marzano Tomatoes. I put a whole 28-ounce can in the blender, and I just gave the tomatoes 3 quick pulses in the blender until they were smooth but still slightly chunky, perfect to cook down into a rich tomato sauce. To actually cook the pizza sauce, I put the burner on medium-low heat and put a nonstick pan on top of that. And I let the pan heat up for about a minute, then I added 2 teaspoons of extra virgin olive oil. I stirred the oil and let that heat up for about 30 seconds to a minute. Then I added 1 teaspoon of dried oregano, stirred it around. Then I got out 1 small clove of garlic, minced it very finely, and then put it right into the pan with the oregano. Then I cooked the garlic and oregano together, stirring for about 30 seconds to a minute until the garlic was nice and fragrant. Then I added 1 teaspoon of salt, stirred it together, and a half teaspoon of white sugar. And I stirred that all together. Then I quickly added the whole 28 ounces of blended tomatoes. Once the tomatoes were in the pan, I stirred everything together and cooked the tomatoes on a low simmer for exactly 10 minutes. After 10 minutes, the sauce had slightly thickened up, and the house was full of the aroma of garlic and oregano. Then I moved this to the fridge where I let the sauce cool down until the evening when I was ready to make my pizza. 6 hours after the dough started rising, it had doubled in size and both doughs were looking bubbly and puffy. It was time to press out the 2 doughs into their pans for the final proof. For the final proof, I got out 2 9x13 baking sheets that I know do pretty well at staying non-stick if I use a little bit of oil. So I put a half tablespoon of oil, extra virgin olive oil, into each pan, spread it around with my fingers so it reached the edge of each pan, and then it was time to put the dough in the pan. The idea here was that I wanted to put the dough into the pan and slowly press it out to the edges, and then let it rise for a couple of hours to get puffy and airy. So the first thing I did was I took the dough out of the bowl and placed it into the pan with the seam side facing down and the smooth side facing up. Then I pressed the dough out with my fingertips, trying to get the dough to take the exact shape and size of the pan. The dough at this point is a little bit too tight and it keeps snapping back when I stretch it out, but eventually if I give it a few minutes to rest, I will be able to stretch it out to fill the entire pan. So since I was making 2 pizzas, I set aside the first dough, pulled out the second pan, and started pressing out the second dough just the same as I had pressed out the first one. Once it had gotten to about 50 to 75% of the pan, I covered them both up with a kitchen towel and let them rest for 10 minutes. Then I uncovered the doughs, and I pressed both of them out with my fingertips until finally, in the second round of pressing, the doughs finally reached the edges of the pan. I gave them a little bit of extra pulling and pressing in with my thumbs against the edge until they were exactly where I wanted them. Once both doughs were pressed out, they were ready for their final rise. So I put a little bit of olive oil on the top of each dough just to create a non-stick barrier. Then I covered them with a kitchen towel and let the doughs proof at room temperature for 2 hours. This second rise or proofing step is essential in Sicilian pizza because it gives it a nice airy and puffy crust. My doughs definitely looked puffier and more filled out after the 2-hour proof. At this point, I covered up the doughs again so that they could rest while I preheated the oven. I wanted to par bake these pizza crusts on their own before topping them because I know it gives me the crispiest result. So I preheated my oven to 350 degrees Fahrenheit, planning to bake them for just 10 minutes at 350. This is a method that I got from Charlie Anderson's YouTube channel, and it works really well. So I preheated my oven to 350 degrees Fahrenheit with the rack closer to the top of the oven, and then I decided I would remove my pizza steel because I don't really need it for this. This is definitely the kind of pizza you can make in your home oven with just everyday things that you would find in anyone's kitchen. So to par bake these pizza doughs, I got the pans out, and then I got 1 tablespoon more or less of pizza sauce, that tomato sauce I made earlier, and then added a few tablespoons of water to that. This is kind of a strange step, but the basic idea is that you make a watered down tomato sauce that you top your pizza doughs with before you par bake them. This watered down tomato sauce will keep the dough from getting too brown and crispy in the oven while you're par baking it. And while you could just use a thin layer of regular tomato sauce, that can sometimes get a little dry and pasty in the oven, while the watered down sauce does not. So this unique extra step gives a very good result if you're par baking your dough in the oven before topping it. So I par baked my pizza doughs at 350 degrees Fahrenheit for 12 minutes, and by the end of 12 minutes, the pizza crusts were fully baked, they were nice and fluffy and set. But they were par baked. They weren't fully cooked with brown edges and a crispy bottom like I want in the final pizza. But that's okay. The idea is I want to half bake them now and then fully bake them later once I've added the rest of the pizza toppings. So I let the pizza crusts fully cool down on top of my stove for a few hours until I was ready to make dinner. And when I was ready to make dinner, I preheated the oven to 550 degrees Fahrenheit, which is as high as my oven will go, and I kept the rack close to the top of the oven just like before. So with the oven preheated, it was time to make my first sourdough Sicilian pizza. This one I was making was plain cheese. I took a half tablespoon of olive oil and spread it around the 9x13 baking sheet up to the edges, and then I added one of my par-baked pizza doughs right on top of the oil. Then I added 8 ounces of whole milk, low moisture mozzarella cheese that I shredded myself at home. I found one at Walmart. It's a 1-pound whole milk, low moisture mozzarella that I really like. To make 2 pizzas, I cut the block in half, and then I shredded the cheese into 2 8-ounce portions using my cheese grater. Enough for 2 9x13 pans of pizza. I spread out the cheese as evenly as I could, almost to the edges, but I did leave a little bit of crust on the edge. This is a sauce on top of the cheese type of pizza. If you're wondering, I did test doing the sauce first and cheese on top of that, but I ended up preferring the sauce on top style. With this method, the cheese bakes into the crust a little bit so it doesn't slide off when you're eating it, and the sauce actually has a chance to caramelize in the oven because of the direct heat. Overall, I think sauce on top seems to be a good option for baking this type of pizza in a home oven. To add the sauce to this cheese pizza, I just went around the entire pizza putting dollops of tomato sauce anywhere I really wanted to. I wanted to leave some areas where the cheese would bubble up to the top and caramelize in the oven as well. You could completely cover the cheese with sauce if you like things extra saucy, but I prefer putting the sauce in random dollops and lines around the pizza. For the last ingredient, I added a healthy amount of grated Pecorino Romano cheese. I've still got this block from my sourdough deep dish video. You could use Parmesan if you prefer that, but I love Pecorino, and this pizza was ready to bake. For the next sourdough Sicilian pizza, I was trying to recreate this trio pizza from Crispy Pizza in Brooklyn. It has pesto sauce, marinara sauce, and vodka sauce on this pizza, so it's a trio of sauces. So I added a half tablespoon of oil to the pan, added the pizza crust, then topped it with 8 ounces of whole milk mozzarella cheese, and I spread that almost all the way to the edges, just like with the cheese pizza. Then of course for the sauces, I had my homemade tomato sauce, then the cheapest creamy vodka sauce I could find at the store, because wow, vodka sauce can be expensive, and basil pesto, the best one I could find that's made with olive oil. Not everything has to be homemade. The restaurant I got this idea from puts 3 different lines of sauces onto the pizza before baking, but I like to do lines of tomato sauce, followed by lines of the vodka sauce, and then I hold off on adding the pesto until after the pizza's done baking. I think it comes out better that way without overcooking the pesto. After the lines of sauce and some more Pecorino Romano, both pizzas were ready for the oven. So I slid the pizza pans into the upper rack of my oven and baked them at 550 degrees Fahrenheit for 10 minutes. During the 10 minutes of baking, the crust will start to turn brown and crispy on the sides and on the bottom. The sauces will caramelize from the heat of the oven and also protect the cheese from getting too hot and burning. After the pizzas were done baking, I transferred them onto a cutting board and let them rest for about a minute until I was ready to finish them with the rest of the toppings. To the cheese pizza, I added a fresh grating of Pecorino Romano cheese, and then about a piece of basil per slice of pizza, just for good measure. And then a little extra Pecorino Romano on top of the basil, just because. For the pizza with a trio of sauces, all I needed to add next was a drizzle of basil pesto, trying to get at least a little bit of pesto in each of the 6 slices of pizza. I finished it off with another grating of Pecorino Romano cheese, and these pizzas were ready to slice. I cut each pizza into 6 equally sized pieces, so you get 4 corner pieces and 2 side pieces in each pizza. Corners are the best. This cheese pizza was absolutely delicious, and with a little bit of basil, it gives kind of a margarita feel to the pizza. It definitely has a crispy bottom all the way through and crispy sides. It was an amazing homemade sourdough pizza. And if you love sauce and want to change up your flavors a little bit, the trio pizza is for you. The bottom is just as crispy as the other pizza, and the 3 sauces give you a different flavor in every single bite. If you love making sourdough and you're interested in this style of pizza, give this recipe a try. I'll see you in the next video.